Welcome to Benefits Redefined, a series of conversations focused on rewriting the employer playbook. If you're an employer today, you're being pulled in a dozen directions at once. Rising healthcare costs, increasingly complex care decisions, growing employee expectations, and constant innovation. Too often, those forces are treated separately. Costs live in one conversation, care in another, culture somewhere else entirely. This podcast exists because those things don't actually operate in silos. I'm Richard Silberstein, and I work with a group of colleagues across the country who spend our time helping employers move beyond transactional benefits and towards strategies that actually work in the real world. Each episode features practitioners who are in the work every day, not theorists, not sales pitches, but people helping employers navigate what's next in employee benefits, healthcare risk, and enterprise strategy. In today's session, we'll cover another hot topic: as benefit costs keep rising, how employers are optimizing their benefits. It's great to have Prabal Lakhanpal back for a follow-up from our previous conversation on enterprise risk. Prabal is the National Practice Leader, Alternate Risk and Captives at Alera Group. Over the last month, we've had several conversations with employers, leadership teams on managing risk, how they set the reserves, just a lot of great discussions that I felt more people need to hear that. So today we're going to unpack it with Prabal. Welcome today, Prabal. Good to have you here.
Always good to spend time with you, Richard. Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. So I wanted to have you back for people to hear some of the client stories we've been having as a follow-up to our discussion on enterprise risk. And we have some situations that I feel like when I talk to you and I see the facial expressions on leadership teams and executive teams where they have that aha moment, right? I'm like, more people need to understand that. So I'm going to frame it up, and then, you and I all sort of, as we like to say, ham and egg, go back and forth. But what I'm seeing is with a lot of business owners and CEOs is that, we have geopolitical going on. We have the impact of AI. Combine that with the fact that healthcare claims are up, large claimants are up. People are worried about, what's going to happen with their cost. And then on the meeting that we had, and again, I bumped into a CEO at a coffee shop who said, I'm just not sure if we're reserving right. Am I under-reserving? Am I over-reserving? If we have a bad year next year, if we have to come up with more money, that costs the partner. So I just wanted to unpack that a little bit with you. So let's talk about the call we had with the executive team and maybe gives the listeners a little perspective from your perspective as to what you heard and what they ask you to try to solve. And then we'll sort of go back and forth.
Yeah. So to frame the conversation, as you mentioned, you sort of ran into them in terms of looking for a little bit more guidance on, hey, are we reserving appropriately? How does a reserve sort of impact their ownership, right? From a stakeholder perspective financially was something they alluded to, right? Every time the reserve moves, it has an impact on what's happening with the partnership. That's sort of where when you and I started talking about it, I talked a little bit about the importance of getting underneath what exactly does that ownership structure look like for them? Because that has a massive impact on how we may go about the reserving process and what sort of tools and solutions we might bring to the table. So if I take a massive step back, the primary question was, are we reserving appropriately? This is reserving for medical claims below their self-insured retention, right? How much of a reserve should be holding on a annual basis? Given the volatility we're seeing in the stop loss markets, is this reserve appropriate? And then can we stress test it? So how do we go about solving for that, right? We undertake a historical reserve evaluation, collecting 5 years of historical claims to build out a Monte Carlo simulation model, which then comes back with a varying degree of claims thresholds. Then we sort of implement or run them through a confidence level analysis to say, on an expected basis, if everything was utopian in the world and you ran exactly how we, from an actual perspective, would project you to run, you would be at X. But we recognize, right, that the expected case could vary substantially, plus or minus. So now let's do some sensitivity analysis to say what would happen if we went up in our confidence level. So if you go from a confidence level of 60 to 70 or 80, what does that mean? That's actuarial speak for saying if you're in an 80% confidence level, 8 out of 10 years or 8 out of 10 simulations, your reserve amount will be ample to cover your actual claims. If you're at a 90% confidence level, you will be 9 out of 10 simulations or 9 out of 10 years, right? From a client perspective, you will have ample reserves to pay out what you have from a claims perspective. But what does this really mean? Because if that's how we thought about it, then everybody would just go and pick the 100th, right, confidence level. Now, why does that not work? For a few different reasons. First, we have to understand where auditors sit, because any reserve that is held on the books of an organization is usually considered a deduction for them, structured appropriately. And there's a caveat around why we should be thinking about all these pieces. We can talk about that in a little bit more detail. But for now, if you're holding a reserve, you have to actually determine it with standard operating processes and actuarial standards of practice. Most audit firms likely will not accept a reserve with a confidence level higher than somewhere between 70 to 80%. Why is that? Because actually, from an auditing perspective, you should not be over-reserving to such a degree that you don't have any risk of loss from a reserve standpoint. If you continuously over-reserve year over year, that can lead to a massive amount of over-reserving and compounding of that reserve. So most audit firms will likely get comfortable with somewhere in that 70 to 80% threshold, confidence level threshold, that they'll be okay reserving at. So that's the sort of the first threshold I think of when we start talking about this. Now, when we've gone through the process of doing confidence level analysis for them, what we're really finding out is they have ample reserves. And when we do a look back to say, how have those reserves changed on an annual basis, that's where their ownership structure plays an important role in determining why certain things were being done the way they were. So they're a partnership. Functionally, what that meant was every dollar of reserve that is held or released may have a material impact on their individual income statements at the end of the year. For every dollar that drops to the bottom line that is not expected income from their perspective, they now need to find the additional dollars to pay taxes on it. And that was creating a pain point for them that they hadn't articulated yet, but was something that they were facing on an annual basis. As we went through the process, we started talking to them about creating an insurance structure may benefit in helping them solve some of the volatility that they're seeing on an annual basis. And I think that, to me, has been the biggest light bulb moment for them, to say, hey, not only can we find a better way to reserve for our claims, but we can find a more long-term mechanism that allows us to insulate ourselves from the up and down cyclicality of the medical stop loss, of the medical sort of claims market. I'll tie all of this in with the conversation we had on our previous podcast together around enterprise risk and how sort of that ties in, right? A lot of times we go through this process, the question most folks will come back to us with is, okay, that's great that you can create a reserve mechanism for healthcare costs within a captive, but how does that insulate the budget volatility on a monthly basis, annual basis? And the answer there really is that when we create a structure like that, we're creating a diversified insurance portfolio for folks. This is a concept, I've said it before, right? I think about it very much like creating an investment thesis. You create a diversified investment portfolio that eliminates a lot of the volatility of the investment markets and allows you to have a consistent growth mechanism. Taking that same philosophy, implementing it through an actuarial lens in a diversified investment portfolio, what we're functionally able to create is a very, very low threshold of volatility. We've got clients who have leveraged programs like this and are running multiple lines of coverage through their risk portfolios, creating a very, very diverse risk portfolio And what that has functionally got them to is a volatility band of plus minus a few percentage points. So when we meet with their executive team on a quarterly and an annual basis, we're focused on our first comment to them is, we projected our expected case claims to be X, and our actual claims trended at plus minus 2, 3, 4%. That, from a financial perspective, from a CFO's perspective, is massively valuable, because that is creating predictability for them on an annual basis as well as on a monthly basis.
Yeah. What's interesting is that they had a substantial increase in claims, that couple bad years that reduced their reserve, right?
Yep.
Which made them wondering if they were underfunded. Well, it turns out from your confidence indicator, which is what he wanted, which is what's the confidence where I am, that was that they were fine with where they were. But also the discussion about how the partners are either going to have to pay taxes on that money the way it's funded, right?
Yeah.
And so there's like, why do I want to, I shouldn't really over-reserve too much, because then I'm incurring taxes for the partners. And I just think of all the S corporations, partnerships, from that standpoint.
Yeah.
So talk about, for people listening that might be certain industries, right, or certain size employers, talk about where maybe how they could structure that reserve on a more tax efficient basis, or talk about the role maybe a captive plays, because sort of the rule of thumb is if you have over 500 employees, 2 million of P&C. So let's sort of unpack that as we look at that. And then we'll go into sort of the next topic that ties to that, was they had looked at P&C captives before, but it didn't make sense. But now they could tie all that together.
Yeah, so you're right. The thumb rule from our perspective is if you've got over 500 employees and you've got about $2 million of insurance premium, you should at least be thinking about alternate risk strategies. Captives is certainly one of them. They've become extremely popular over the last few years. And one of the reasons that is happening more and more is that folks are looking for ways to change the way insurance markets view them, right? I talk about this idea that insurance markets want to view employers and want to underwrite through the lens of 1 year, one risk coverage, one renewal, right? Which is functionally to say they want to view you for how you performed in the last year, maybe in the last 2 years on the healthcare side of the house. That's a great way of underwriting for risk, but that's not a great way of funding for risk over a long-term time horizon. The last 12 months tell us what your catastrophic claim structure should be. Last 5 years tell us what your likely trend should be. Now, there's caveats to this conversation. If you're an organization where the demographic of your group is changing quickly, evolving quickly, you may want to have some trend factors that account for those adjustments. But it's really the last 3 to 5 years that tell us how this group as a whole is going to be performing on an annual basis. This is where the confidence level analysis plays an important role to say, on an expected basis, we believe a stable group of individuals accessing similar healthcare as they did for the last few years will continue to trend in a consistent pattern year over year. Now, there will absolutely be catastrophic claim spikes along the way. That's the nature of healthcare today. Medical stop loss is priced to be a 1 in 5 year coverage, which functionally means 1 in 5 years, there should be a loss on your medical stop loss portfolio. 4 out of 5 years, you should be in a surplus position. Why is it that captives have become more popular for healthcare? It's because insurance carriers are pricing for stop loss coverage to be a 1 in 1 year event at this point.
Good point. Yeah.
Right. And that is, I think, triggering a lot of employers to say, hey, we need to think about this conversation slightly different.
Right.
Right. You think about you and I are having these conversations on an annual basis with clients to say, hey, you should be pushing up your stop loss thresholds to account for inflation. But take a step back. What are we really telling the clients? We're telling the clients, hey, you're paying $2 million for certain coverage above $200,000 today. If you don't want to pay a disproportionate amount of more money for the same coverage, one way of navigating it is to push 200 to 250. We're increasing the total amount of risk profile, right, that employers are taking on. Now, that's unfortunately where employers find themselves if they don't want to be leveraging captives, because you are sort of stuck in the mechanism of taking the coverage that the insurance carriers are providing you. A captive is a way of changing that buying dynamic and going from being a buyer of insurance to a trader of insurance. Now, how does all of this tie into how you may want to think about other lines of coverage, right? It's the concept of short tail risk and long tail risk. It's the concept of bringing together non-correlated entities and organizations and risk profiles together. We spent a lot of time talking about that on our previous podcast, but a Cliff Notes version of it really is you take medical stop loss, which is a short tail risk, and you take workers' comp, which is a long tail risk. You bring both of them together, you've created a diversified portfolio, which becomes much more stable to price. Right? We recently put out an article which speaks about some of the catastrophic nature of claims from where the market is headed. The way to buck that trend, right? That trend is something that the market as a whole is seeing. The question eventually becomes, should an employer be paying for the average trend in the marketplace, or should they be over-indexing on their personal claims, recognizing that you will have a 1 in 5 year event? That 1 in 5 year event could be today. That 1 in 5 year event could be 4 years from now.
Right.
What is the best way to fund for that? And that's really the conversation we're having with CFOs and CEOs, right?
Which, by the way, we're going to have a roundtable on May 5th where we're going to bring together CFOs that want to learn more about that with their peers to talk about that. What's interesting is, and we talked about this, where we see a lot of businesses that have a P&C captive, especially construction, different industries, but it feels as though they haven't done an EB captive because they ran the numbers and juice wasn't worth the squeeze. But I feel like from the conversation we had, they really might not have thought about it as related to the partner's taxes, the business, the volatility. And so I just think that I had an aha moment watching the discussion that more people should think about it holistically, right? And I think you said if you already have a P&C captive, you can sort of leverage that. Is that correct? And on the EB side?
Absolutely. The P&C captives have existed for a long time. Employers have had a lot of success using them. And as more and more employers understand the value of employee benefits, using your existing P&C captive to fund employee benefits is certainly a strategy. And there's a lot of value to it, right? One of the core concepts of this is the way insurance carriers price for risk, right? Is you take $100 of premium, 20 of those dollars is usually accounts for admin expenses. When that $100 becomes $200 of premium, the admin expenses have increased proportionately to 40. When you have your own captive, you take your $100 of P&C premium and you add another $100 of EB premium, your admin costs have merely gone from 20 to, let's call it 25. That delta between 40 and 25, that $15, is now falling to your bottom line. And it's helping you bend that healthcare cost curve or that insurance cost curve that a lot of employers are struggling.
At what size, we brought this up in a discussion where they should think about maybe having their other lines of coverage. Just talk about what are your other lines of coverage that you might put in an EB captive, and then sort of size of employer that should consider that.
In general, life, disability, voluntary lines are popular lines of coverage to think about from an EB captive perspective. I'd say you usually want to at least be at that 2,000-3,000 life mark to want to think about the life, disability, and voluntary side of the house. Having said that, there's a lot of solutions in the marketplace now which are focused on voluntary programs, and there's a lot of conversation around why voluntary programs should be funded through captives. At the heart of it is the idea that a lot of voluntary programs are being underwritten at low loss ratios. And is there a better way for us as employers to fulfill our fiduciary obligations by creating a better program. And captives allow you to potentially create a better ecosystem from it.
Yeah. And the other thing that's interesting, and again, we work with a lot of awesome, amazing HR professionals, and we were at a symposium with your client who talked about not really getting involved in certain aspects of that. So I think what's interesting if you're listening in is you could have some really great HR professionals, benefit professionals that are really managing your benefits well, right? But what it seems like sometimes is there's a disconnect between how they look at things versus sort of enterprise risk, partners, taxes, the business, right? So just want to talk about what you see when you do have conversations like that, because I don't want to take anything away from a lot of clients that do run, I'd say, run well-structured benefit plans and that might have high-performing benefit plans, but they're sort of missing that next level of taking advantage of some opportunity for planning.
Yeah, great comment, and you're spot on, right? In general, HR stakeholders have had the short end of the stick for a very long time, right? Cost for healthcare or benefits in general has been going up at such a fast pace, and they've sort of been navigating how to not pass on a substantial increase to employees because that materially impacts their standard of living, but B, not let that be a disproportionate burden to the employer from a cost perspective. So a lot of stakeholders have created really efficient plans. There's a lot of statistics out there in the marketplace around how quickly a lot of healthcare organizations, healthcare insurers, right, their profit margins have continued to grow. And an underlying thesis to a lot of that conversation is, why is it that we're seeing that substantial increase in profitability when, from a total employment standpoint, right, number of employees out there in the marketplace, it's not changing, right? It's not growing at the same place that the profitability for a lot of organizations is growing. If you take that one step further, right, an underlying thesis to that is they're finding ways of squeezing more from the marketplace to drive additional efficiency and profitability. And when you think about what captives are doing or what this enterprise risk conversation is, it's the same conversation, but we're now changing the perspective through which we talk about this. We, as the insurance company carrier, right, as the captive, want to be able to find a lot of those efficiencies and keep them for ourselves at the enterprise level rather than letting a lot of the marketplace individual stakeholders, carriers, hold on to it. I don't want to discount the value and that insurance carriers bring to the marketplace. This is me not docking them for that, right? A lot of carriers and TPAs and stop loss carriers do a phenomenal job. It's an important conversation for employers to have in terms of what is the best use case for my capital, right? That's, if I take a step back and think about it through the lens of an organization that has multiple portfolio companies, right? The underlying conversation is around capital efficacy. If you and I are running individual operating companies within one holding company structure, I am making decisions based on what is my risk profile. You're making decisions based on what is your risk profile. Prabal feels very comfortable with $1 million of risk. Richard feels a lot more comfortable with $1.5 million of risk. Here's the actual answer though. Both of us are viewing it through a very personal lens. If you look at it through the holding company structure, maybe $750,000 is the appropriate amount of risk, but more often than not, $2.5 million is the appropriate amount of risk. And that conversation, right, to say capital efficacy is at the heart of how you and I should be determining what is the sweet spot for us to take risk, right? And that allows us to go from this conversation of saying, I want only $1 million of risk, I'll buy coverage above $1 million. I want to go from being a buyer of coverage at $1 million to a trader of coverage at 2.5, And that's what this enterprise risk conversation helps us do.
Yeah. The other thing I was to say is we talk about employers over 500, 2 million of premium, but I think it's important for people to know that there's a large amount of really awesome, great captives that pull together a bunch of employers. And so we see employers anywhere from 100 to 500 employees, 300 employees, right, where they don't do a single cell captive, but they're part of a group captive. You just want to touch on that so we have somebody listening saying, well, I'm a smaller employer, that doesn't apply to me, but you can leverage that same concept.
Absolutely. Yeah. The concept of group captives is the idea that somebody went out and created this framework where you don't have to go and do the plumbing, right? The construction of the infrastructure exists. You can jump into an existing captive program and benefit from a lot of the conversation we're having here. Now, there's pros and cons to the approach, but for smaller employers, absolutely, group captives have been a really good solution to help create a better framework to access insurance, be it on the employee benefit side, be it on the P&C side of the house.
Yep. And then the other thing our friend Chris Hogan likes to say in Arizona is that many employers have workman's comp and they're managing that very aggressively versus if they're smaller and on the benefit side, they just get the renewal every year and have to change benefits and shop carriers. And the nice thing is with some of these group captives, they're able to put together programs that are geared more towards employers that are over 1,000, bring those to smaller employers and sort of manage that better from a risk standpoint. And then I think once they understand how to manage it better from a risk standpoint, then they're willing to take more risk, right? So it's just interesting from that standpoint. Hey, before we wrap up, when you think about where we are today and what, you get brought into a lot of situations, requests, anywhere from public companies down to, other projects that we work on. Is there a theme that you're seeing out there as it relates to where we are today in terms of this topic of enterprise risk, especially with some of the changes we're seeing in transparency, fiduciary, economic? Just curious what you would say to the folks listening in.
Yeah, I'll parse my comments out into employee benefits versus P&C.
Sure.
Employee benefits, absolutely. The fiduciary conversation that has been top of mind for a lot of employers, right, has made it imperative that HR stakeholders and senior leaders are focusing a lot more time, effort, energy, making sure the best-in-class benefits are being accessed at the best price point possible. And from my perspective, that due diligence is here to stay. I love what you said, you quoted Chris in terms of bringing, I think of it as bringing a risk manager's lens of due diligence and care into better managing our healthcare claims, right? That's really what the fiduciary concepts are bringing to play. On the P&C side of the house, we went through a very hard market cycle over the last few years. And right now, we're going through a softening market cycle, especially for coverages like property and cyber. Employers who have structured captives prior to the hardening market cycle were able to get ahead of those coverages during the hard market cycle. And now we're seeing a lot of large organizations, large and small organizations, wanting to set up captives, preparing for the next hardening market because they're recognizing the value a captive was able to bring during that time horizon. So a lot of conversation from that side of the house. And, on stop loss, I know we spent a lot of time talking about the fact that stop loss is likely going to go through a hardening market cycle over the next 2-3 years. And that's certainly becoming a larger and larger pain point for employers.
Yeah, and we had a conversation last week with one of our colleagues where they say they have 2 large claimants, so the natural thing is for them to, raise their spec deductible. But like you said, maybe they should think about being in $1 million spec and having a captive, because at some point those claimants are going to drop off, and then are they paying a lot more in premium than they should be? So interesting times. Well, listen, I always say the mind can absorb what the sea can endure. So our listeners have endured 35, 25 minutes of a great conversation on captives, and look forward to having you. I think I think it's May 5th. We're having a roundtable where we're going to have CFOs and peers talking about this. It'll be virtual, so if anybody's listening and wants to learn more about that, you can hit me up on LinkedIn. Thank you, Prabal, for coming and being part of our discussion today, and I look forward to having you back for further conversations on this topic.
Well, thank you for having me. Always get to spend time together. Thank you.